The date is February 28, 2026. The world watches in horror as the Middle East is plunged into its most devastating conflict yet. It began with a surprise joint military operation by the United States and Israel, who launched a series of airstrikes against key Iranian nuclear facilities, including Natanz, claiming it was a preemptive act of self-defense against an imminent threat. They called it Operation Rising Lion, and within hours, the fragile peace that had barely held the region together was shattered, drawing sharp condemnation from around the globe and leaving the United Nations scrambling for an emergency response. Iran's response was swift and devastating, far exceeding the world's expectations. This was not a measured retaliation, but a full-scale, pre-planned assault. From launch sites across the country, a massive barrage of over 200 missiles, including advanced hypersonic weapons, was unleashed, all of them targeting Israel. While Israel's renowned Iron Dome and Arrow defense systems worked with desperate efficiency in the skies above cities like Haifa and Jerusalem, they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the attack. The main target was clear: Tel Aviv, Israel's bustling economic and cultural heart, which found itself under a barrage it could not escape. Missiles rained down on the city, turning the gleaming high-rises of the skyline into towers of fire and smoke. Critical infrastructure like the power grid and communications networks were obliterated, plunging the metropolis into chaos and darkness. The sights and sounds of a modern, thriving city were replaced by the relentless wail of air raid sirens, the thunder of explosions, and the screams of its citizens. As the world witnessed the horrifying images emerging from Israel, Iran's supreme leader appeared on state television to deliver a chilling warning. He declared that this was only the first chapter of their retaliation, promising that any further aggression would be met with an even more devastating response. On the other side of the world, the Pentagon went to the highest state of alert, and the U.S. president addressed a stunned nation from the Oval Office. He vowed to protect American allies and interests, promising that the full force of the American military would be brought to bear. In response, he immediately ordered the deployment of additional carrier strike groups to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, a clear signal that the United States was preparing for a prolonged and major war. The initial surgical strikes had now spiraled into a direct and open confrontation between two nuclear-capable powers. The international community was thrown into a state of panic and paralysis. An emergency session of the UN Security Council devolved into a shouting match, with Russia and China vehemently condemning the U.S.-Israel attack and blocking any resolution that would blame Iran. European allies, caught in the middle, pleaded for an immediate ceasefire, but their calls fell on deaf ears as the momentum of war had already taken over. The attack on Tel Aviv had regional consequences, threatening to drag in other nations. In Lebanon, Hezbollah forces were put on high alert, and in Yemen, the Houthis threatened to launch missiles at U.S. naval vessels. The vital oil fields of Saudi Arabia and the UAE braced for potential strikes, causing global oil prices to skyrocket and stock markets to crash. What began as a conflict between a few nations had instantly become a global crisis, with the potential to shatter the world economy. As the first 24 hours of this new war came to a close, the full scale of the disaster became clear. Tel Aviv lay in ruins, a smoldering monument to the failure of diplomacy. Thousands were dead, and the region was on the brink of an abyss. The initial strikes had not brought peace or security. They had opened a Pandora's box. The message from Tehran was clear: the old rules of engagement no longer applied. With American reinforcements rushing to the region and Israel preparing for a ground response, the world held its breath, knowing that this was not the end, but merely the beginning of a conflict whose outcome was terrifyingly uncertain. The question was no longer who started the war, but how to stop it before the entire Middle East was consumed by fire. The international aid organizations scrambled to organize relief flights, but with Ben Gurion Airport heavily damaged and the airspace still dangerous, getting help to the survivors was a monumental challenge. The human cost of the war was no longer a statistic. It was the face of a grieving father holding a dead child, the empty eyes of a survivor covered in dust, and the endless rows of body bags. The world watched these images, and the outrage began to shift, with many now questioning if the initial attack on Iran had been worth this catastrophic result. In Tehran, the leadership celebrated what they called a divine victory. The streets erupted in massive pro-government rallies, with crowds burning American and Israeli flags. The narrative from the Iranian regime was clear. They had humiliated the mighty American and Israeli militaries, proving that their power was an illusion. However, in the halls of power, the mood was more cautious. Intelligence reports confirmed that while the attack on Tel Aviv was a strategic success, it had also united their enemies. In Washington, the political landscape was fracturing. The president faced a storm of criticism from opposition parties who demanded to know why the military was unprepared for such a massive retaliation. Protests erupted in major American cities, with citizens chanting, "No more war," forcing the White House to balance its aggressive foreign policy with the rising anger of its own people. The military escalation continued at a frightening pace. The American carrier strike groups, the USS Gerald R. Ford and the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, took up positions in the eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea. Their orders were clear: establish air superiority and protect Israel from any further Iranian attacks. But the region was a powder keg. As American warships patrolled the waters, Iranian speedboats from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy began harassing commercial tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most important oil passageway. A tense cat-and-mouse game unfolded on the high seas. Suddenly, a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Thomas Hudner, detected an incoming missile threat from the Iranian coast. The ship's Phalanx close-in weapon system activated, shredding the sky with bullets to intercept a missile that came dangerously close. The message from Iran was received. If America wanted a war in the Persian Gulf, they were ready to fight it there too. This naval confrontation sent shockwaves through the global economy. The price of Brent crude oil, the international benchmark, exploded past $150 a barrel, a level not seen in decades. Stock markets from Tokyo to London to New York plunged into freefall, wiping out trillions of dollars in value. The term stagflation returned to the lexicon of economists, who warned of a global recession worse than 2008. Gas stations across Europe and America saw panic buying, with long lines forming as prices at the pump doubled overnight. The war, which had seemed so distant to the average citizen just days ago, was now hitting their wallets and their daily lives with brutal force. The conflict was no longer just a regional crisis, it was a full-blown global economic emergency. Amidst the chaos, a desperate diplomatic effort was underway. The United Nations Secretary-General, along with mediators from Qatar and Oman, shuttled between Tehran and Washington, trying to find a path to de-escalation. The demands from each side were impossible for the other to accept. Iran demanded a complete cessation of all American and Israeli military activities in the region and an end to all sanctions, which was a non-starter for the U.S. America and Israel demanded the complete dismantling of Iran's missile program and a guarantee that they would never pursue nuclear weapons, which was equally unacceptable to Tehran. The talks were going nowhere, and as the diplomats talked, the generals prepared for the next phase. Satellites spotted massive movements of Iranian ballistic missiles to new launch sites, while Israeli tank divisions were seen massing near the Lebanese border, a clear sign that a ground invasion to crush Hezbollah might be imminent. The world stood on the edge of a cliff, and the next step could send everyone tumbling into the abyss. The clock struck midnight on March 2, 2026, and the war entered its most terrifying phase yet. The Israeli War Cabinet, meeting in a bunker beneath Jerusalem, made a fateful decision. They could not afford to fight a war on two fronts indefinitely. Their strategy was clear: eliminate the threat from the north first. In the early hours of the morning, the Israeli Defense Forces launched Operation Northern Shield, a massive ground invasion of southern Lebanon. The stated goal was to push Hezbollah forces back beyond the Litani River and create a buffer zone to protect Israeli communities. Thousands of Israeli troops, supported by hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles, crossed the border. But they did not find the empty fields they expected. They walked into a trap. Hezbollah, warned by Iranian intelligence, had prepared for this moment for years. The first waves of Israeli Merkava tanks were met with a storm of Russian-made Kornet anti-tank missiles fired from concealed bunkers and underground tunnels. The invasion, intended to be swift, immediately bogged down into a brutal, bloody grind. The hills of southern Lebanon, already scarred by decades of conflict, once again became a graveyard for soldiers on both sides. As the ground war in Lebanon intensified, the conflict took an even darker turn into the shadows of cyberspace. For weeks, American and Israeli cyber commands had been probing Iran's digital defenses. Now they unleashed their most powerful weapons. A sophisticated computer worm, years in the making, was deployed against Iran's critical infrastructure. Its target was not military but civilian. In Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz, the lights went out. The power grid, carefully managed by computerized control systems, simply failed. Hospitals plunged into darkness, water pumping stations ground to a halt, and the bustling streets of the capital fell into a silent, terrifying blackout. But Iran had learned from past attacks, like Stuxnet, and had developed its own cyber arsenal. In retaliation, Iranian hackers, working with state-sponsored groups, launched a coordinated assault on American infrastructure. Across the United States, the attack hit with devastating precision. The Colonial Pipeline, the vital artery for fuel on the East Coast, was shut down by ransomware. Air traffic control systems at major airports like Chicago O'Hare and Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson experienced critical failures, grounding thousands of flights. Most terrifying of all, hackers breached the supervisory systems of a water treatment plant in a major American city, altering chemical levels in a failed attempt to poison the water supply. The home front, once safe from the physical destruction of war, was now a battlefield of its own, a silent, invisible war where the enemy could strike from anywhere. In Tel Aviv, amidst the ruins, a different kind of battle was being fought for the soul of the city. Survivors emerged from shelters to find their homes destroyed, their families torn apart. The international aid that had been promised began to trickle in, but it was nowhere near enough. Makeshift field hospitals were set up in parks and school gymnasiums. The streets were patrolled not just by soldiers, but by ordinary citizens armed with whatever they could find: determined to protect what little remained. The social fabric of the city, known for its vibrant cafes, tech startups, and beachfront nightlife, was fraying. Fights broke out over food and water. The government, struggling to maintain order, imposed a strict curfew. Yet, amidst the chaos, there were stories of incredible humanity. Neighbors who had never spoken before shared their last loaf of bread.